So as we start chapter 6, we want to realize that we're changing the game a little bit, right? We've spent the last couple of chapters talking about the Gilded Age, the Second Industrial Revolution, and how America was imperialist overseas. Now we want to talk about what happens at home after Americans have had a taste of the Gilded Age. This next chapter runs from 1900 to 1920. It's called the Progressive Era, and the reason that we call it the Progressive Era, it's the first time Americans really want to see change in their government, and people from all different walks of life and political parties, Republicans or Democrats, come together to create change. So I think that's the first thing you have to understand, that progressives are not an organized political movement. They're just a collection of different ideas, activities, all designed to do just a couple of things. They want to reform government to give voters more control. They also want to support reforms that improve the lives of workers, because we know that government was corrupt. Remember those political machines and party bosses, and we know that workers were having a really tough time. Remember things like child labor and working conditions and low pay. Now, really, progressives look at this pretty clearly. They say, in order for us to make any changes to society, what we need to do is fix government first. If we can fix government, then government can help us fix problems. Now, progressives would look at government and all of the problems there, and they would say, well, I wonder if there's like a scientific way or some technology that could help us fix government, because they had a strong faith in science and technology. Remember, this is the place that brought us the automobile, right? That brings us the record players and telephones and light bulbs and all kinds of amazing things that were changing the way the world worked. So maybe science and technology could help us solve some of these problems too. And the first step to solving a problem is to talk about it, right? To expose it, to admit that it actually exists. And journalists, the ones who were doing the yellow journalism with the Spanish-American War, realize that corruption and scandal sells really well in newspapers. So a bunch of journalists, and they call themselves muck rakers, because they rake through the muck, through the filth, through the grime and bad stuff of society, to expose corruption and scandal. And the goal is to raise our awareness so that we see the government and social problems that are out there. An example of this would be a guy named Jacob Riis, who is a photojournalist. He takes pictures and then talks about the pictures he takes. His book, called How the Other Half Lives, focuses on social problems and exposes all kinds of problems. And the hope is that by exposing those problems, you can inspire change. That's the goal. Expose problems to inspire change. And he would expose homelessness and crime and alcoholism and all kinds of things like that. Progressives, recognizing that just exposing corruption to inspire change was definitely something that had to come first, they realized that there have to be some basic changes to government to take power away from party machines. So they support a number of different ideas. One of them is called the direct primary, and this is what we have in a lot of states in America right now. The way it works is that when there's a time to elect a candidate for an office, anyone in a political party can vote for a candidate of their choice. It used to be that the party bosses would tell you, this is the one candidate that you will vote for, or this is the enemy, the guy you will not vote for. And you never had a choice with who you wanted to vote for. Think about it like this for president. We look at the presidential candidates in the last election that President Trump won, and you see at least 4 different Democratic candidates that the Democrats could choose from, and there were a whole bunch of Republican candidates that the Republicans could choose from. And in state after state, voters went to these direct primaries and they said, I want this person, and then I want that person, until finally we had just 2 left. And the entire country chose, do you want Donald Trump or do you want Hillary Clinton? And of course, Donald Trump won the Electoral College vote, which means he ends up as president. So That's a good example of a way you can take power back from a political machine by letting the people choose who they want to run for office. Another way might be something called the initiative. And the way this works is citizens put something on the ballot. They introduce legislation that people vote on, and it requires the state legislature, the state Congress, to vote on it. An example of this would be marijuana legalization. By passing an initiative on marijuana legalization, you force your state's legislature, in this case ours is in Harrisburg, right? That's our state capital, to vote on whether or not we should legalize marijuana. And initiatives like this have happened all over the place. Washington, Colorado, and many different states in the country, Connecticut. And so we see state legislatures forced to vote on things like medical marijuana, or even legalization outright. And that process is beginning to change, regardless of whether or not people like it or don't like it. Another example might be a referendum, and this is a bit different. This is where you, as a citizen, get to vote on something directly. The difference between an initiative is, okay, so here's the language. It says, the Pennsylvania State Legislature must vote on medical marijuana, yes or no. And if you vote yes on this initiative, then it has to go to the state. And the state says, well, should we legalize it, yes or no? And if they choose yes, then it does become the law. If they choose no, then nothing happens to it. A referendum is different. It says, should we make marijuana legal? And you choose yes or no. And if enough people choose yes, it automatically becomes law. It skips that step in Harrisburg. That's the difference between those two. But both of them give power to the people and take it away from political machines. And you can even make this more powerful by working harder on something called suffrage, which is the right to vote. Women, for example, were denied that right until 1920. That's women's suffrage, the woman's right to vote. And states across America, starting out west, moving east, really worked hard to give women the right to vote. And finally, there was a constitutional amendment, the 19th Amendment, that Congress favored to give women suffrage. And that finally passed and allowed people regardless of what sex you were, the right to vote. And again, that puts power in the hands of the people, more people than ever before, not a political machine. And with the people having so much more control, now they can really pass laws that will help them and fix their social problems. Social problems like minimum work days, right? The amount of work in a week that you could do, limits on the hours per day you could work. The fact that we could have education for all kids, compulsory education. These are all big deals. In fact, there was a new movement growing up at the time called temperance, the temperance movement. And they focused on limiting alcohol consumption, even pushing for its ban later on, because alcohol was destroying American society and culture, creating all kinds of problems for people, rich and poor. And progressives looking at these social problems, they said, there has to be something that we can do to protect the average person, the average worker. We need to start regulating big business. We need to regulate them to protect workers. Some progressives even go so far as to say, the government shouldn't just regulate business, the government should outright own business. We call that socialism now. It was a highly controversial idea because it's the exact opposite of laissez-faire, right? You have laissez-faire, government out of the way, then you have government regulation, and then on this end is government completely owning business. It's the exact opposite of laissez-faire. So it was a highly controversial idea in this effort to try and protect workers. And I think as we step back and we look at all of this, I think it provides you with a really good summary for what we can talk about in class as we introduce you to the progressive movement.